I will say hello to everyone and welcome to this timely CEFTUS session titled From Military Tutelage to Cartel State, How Turkey's Oppressive Rule Has Been Consolidated. I am Yavuz Baydar and will moderate the 90-minute long session. I am the editor of Ahval News Online, a trilingual independent news and comment site covering Turkey in all major relevant aspects in Turkish, Arabic, and English. In many ways, it is a fully pluralist open forum for free public debate, just as CEFTUS is. We have with us a distinguished scholar, a top expert on Turkey and Kurds, Professor Hamit Bozarslan. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
For those who follow the academic output, Bozarslan is an internationally renowned figure, a bold and sharp observer, offering us steadily his unique perspectives, often in historic context. He's an extremely interesting reader of Turkey, of the past, present, and future. Bozarslan is Director of Studies at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, EHES, in Paris. He's the author of a series on the Kurdish issue and Middle Eastern politics, including, pardon my French, Histoire de la Turquie, de l'Empire à nos jours, and Le luxe et la violence, domination et contestation chez Ibn Khaldun, and Révolution et état de violence, Moyen-Orient, and l'antidémocratie au XXe siècle, Iran, Russie, Turkey. Professor Bozarslan is currently researching currents of anti-democracy in the 21st century. A few words about the topic tonight. I said it is very timely because the series of events reflecting the profound crisis snowballing in Turkey since, let's say, Gezi Park protests in 2013, they have in the past weeks accelerated geometrically as the collapse of the rule of law and the separation of powers continued. In the past 2 weeks, we have seen some major developments. A closure case is filed against the pro-Kurdish HDP party, the third largest elected group in parliament. The government quit the Istanbul Convention, which was aimed at protecting women and various sexual orientations. And since yesterday, the country is dragged into the vortex of a big financial crisis. All this and many other aspects have to do with the state system. Its causes now producing more and more spectacular consequences for the country, for its people, and for its foreign relations. For decades following the transition to the pluralism from one-party rule, Turkey's administrative system was functionalized on the basic principle of tutelage, with its powerful military brass shaping its order, and at times through coups, coup d'etats. This pattern has reached its limits at the end of the 1990s and ended after the Justice and Development Party, AKP, came to power by a landslide in 2002. This has marked a series of even more radical shifts on many levels, reflecting its will mainly on the structure and the institutions of the state. This transformation accelerated after the attempted coup with the introduction of long-term state of emergency in 2016 and the historic referendum in 2017, which fundamentally changed the system. Following the adoption of the super presidential rule, the separation of powers and the rule of law underwent a profound metamorphosis. Professor Bozarslan argues that the current rule is a form of cartel state involving various hardline stakeholders and shadow circles. How did Turkey come to such a change? How does the current rule operate? With what its implications on the complex society? And most curiously, does it have a future? He will offer his deep analysis on the very timely subject, as I said. A few words before I leave the word to Professor Bozarslan. It will be about 40 minutes introduction, presentation, more or less. He may speak a little longer if he wishes to. And questions will be sent to me by written form. I will convey them later on in the second part. And at the end of the session, in the 19th minute, let's say, we will have a family photo. For those who do not wish to be in that family photo, they will simply have to shut down their cameras. So here's the time. Professor Bozarslan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Yavuz. It's a pleasure to be with you. Although the conditions are not very good, neither in Greece, Britain, nor in France, nor in Turkey. I will intervene on a very unpleasant subject, the notion of the cartel state, the paramilitarization. And I will start with some theoretical perspectives and offer you a genealogy of the cartel state in Turkey. The concept of the cartel state has been used, as far as I know, in the 1980s in the Latin American literature on the political sociology, analyzing the state both under the military regimes, but also after the collapse of the oligarchies in the 1980s as a cartel. And at the end of the 1990s, a colleague of us, Ümit Cizre, has analyzed by the Turkish state as a cartel state. In the year 2000, Michel Camus, a colleague of mine in France, and myself, we have suggested also the concept of the cartel state in order to understand the making of the Arab states and the durability of the Arab states, but also the crisis of the Arab state, which was quite obvious by then. What do we understand by the notion of the cartel state? The cartel state is, before everything, the existing of a hardcore which constitutes the center of power, power being understood as economic, military, and political power at the same time. This hardcore is usually incarnated in a person or in his family. For instance, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt was the hardcore of the power with their respective families. But the cartel state cannot only be based on the personal incarnation of power. It requires also other components, and these components were, for the Arab states, the army, obviously, but that was also the military, the intelligence services, and we know that in the Arab states there were many intelligence services have been created in the 1990s. The comprador bourgeoisie, a kind of comprador bourgeoisie or rentier bourgeoisie, which has profited from the technological inventions of the 1990s, mainly in the telecommunications, was also a part of the cartel state, and the cartel state co-opted some local actors during the elections for one mandate or for a second mandate, and through them exerted a real presence within the society. And in order to understand the functioning of this cartel state, we maybe refer us to a double concept that has been used in the 1920s and 1930s in the totalitarian regimes, under the totalitarian regimes. The first concept was the Führer principle. It means that the leader is the leader and fixes through his principles and his will the green lights and the red lights. And at the same time, a polycracy. It means that beyond the will, but through the will of the leader, you have an ensemble of corporations, military and economic and political corporations, security corporations that govern the state. And this cartel state means that at once you have a paramilitary state, because the components of the cartel state, they do not obey to the institutionality, to the logic of institutions of a rational state, as Weber has defined it. It means that you have a para-state at every level, in the levels of the ministers, on the level of the appointment, in the level of co-optation of the actors, and a para-economy. It means that the economy that you see through the figures given by the economic institutions, they do reflect only a part of the real situation. A large sector of the economy is not controlled directly by the institutions, legal institutions, but by other institutions. introducing this element also means that a cartel state cannot be a viable state if it does not destroy the institutions. One of the points that link maybe the cartel state of the 2000s to the former totalitarian regimes, they are very different regimes, but still this point is a common point, is the destruction of the institutions, but because any kind of institutions include or impose a mechanism of check and control and balances, and the cartel state cannot accept the existence of the check and balances. These check and balances have to be destroyed, but the destruction of them means that you produce at one side a loyalty, the loyalty to the leader, but a loyalty also to different components of the cartel state, and at the same time you might be tempted by the destruction of your economy and wealth in order, for instance, to satisfy such and such component of the cartel state. And it is very clear, for instance, when you read a colleague of us, Mahrat Wahabi, on Iran, you see that the Iranian economic decisions are in some cases deliberately disastrous decisions, because having a rational economic policy will mean that you deprive the cartel, the components of the cartel, from their own resources, that you introduce mechanisms of control and check and balances, and these mechanisms of check and balances cannot be accepted by the components of the cartel state. And that clearly shows you that in a cartel state, we are not in a Weberian sociology. As you know, Weber has defined the state as an ensemble of rational institutions governed by an internal rationality. But the Weberian sociology also suggests that at the beginning of the state, you don't have any rationality, but you have a predatory logic, you have a mafia kind of group, and this mafia kind of group that tries to monopolize the fiscal resources of the society and through violence. And that's thanks to institutionalization that the state becomes a rational ensemble of the institutions. While in the cartel state, you destroy this rationality and you return back potentially to the origins of the state. It means the monopolization of power by a small group, a mafia-like group of predatory actors. So that's my theoretical introduction, but we can come back to this issue during the discussion session. And now I will try to give some elements, historical elements, but also sociological elements in order to understand the evolution of the cartel state in Turkey, and evolution, but not historical evolution, but also sociological features of the cartel state in Turkey. When you take the last Ottoman period, the late Ottoman period, you are absolutely struck by one thing. On one side, you have a tremendous number of institutions that are built, and these institutions are reflecting at the same time the process of Occidental westernization of the late Ottoman Empire. And at the same time, these institutions do exist with other institutions which have no official existence. You have constantly a double state which is internal and external. And my reading is that the emergence of this double state, internal and external, has started with Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid II has ruled from 1876 up to 1909. And Abdul Hamid's external state was a respectable state with competent people. There were also some Armenians, for instance, who were appointed as minister. They were official diplomats, they were official generals. And at the same time, when you read the memoirs linked to this period, you see very much clearly that beyond this external visible state, you have an internal state, and the element of this internal state, they are not, they have no official position, Many of them, they are not even Turks. Many of them, they are Muhajirs, migrants coming from from Caucasia. And one of them, Zeki Pasha, who is a general, recognized as a general, will even build a parallel Kurdish army called the Hamidian Army. And the Hamidian Army was one of the main structures used during the massacres of the Armenians in the 1890s and later on during the genocide of the Armenians. So this internal state has had its own army, had its own secret police to some extent, had its own economical structures. Abdul Hamid II, the second, had his own funds in order to finance some activities, and Abdul Hamid II had clearly the imaginary, the Kurdistan and Arabia were the internal colonies, and developed a very much personalized policy vis-a-vis these regions. So I will say that the beginning of the cartel state goes back to the end of the 19th century. And what is very interesting in this perspective is to see that Abdul Hamid, Hamidian regime, the regime of Abdul Hamid, presented itself as a project of restoration of the old Ottoman traditions. The obsession of Abdul Hamid was to create identically what he perceived as the true Turkish Ottoman model of the state. And for him, the Sultan was the incarnation of the system, of the state, and the Sultan had to have his own networks in order going beyond the state's institutionality in order to be able to govern the country. Immediately after Abdul Hamid, who is marginalized by 1908 pronunciamento of a Committee Union and Progress, and who is overthrown in 1909. Immediately after Abdul Hamid, you have the formation of a second cartel state. And this cartel state is a very interesting cartel state, just to say, to fix the terms for those who may not be very familiar with the Turkish history. In 1908, you have what you call the Young Turk Revolution. The Young Turk Revolution is actually not a revolution, as we could observe it in Iran and in Russia during slightly the same period. There's a military pronunciamento, and it is this pronunciamento is the work of a committee called Committee Union and Progress. From that point of view, one can speak about unionism, and unionism is a very interesting case. Unionism constitutes the first party state in the world history. At the beginning of the 20th century, you don't have any other single party system, state party system as that I am aware of, except in the Ottoman Empire. The unionism combines revolution and violence. In other words, presents itself at once as a state and afford or reserves to itself the capacity of using the state's coercion as a state, and at the same time uses violence as a revolutionary power, revolutionary contest. And so you have at once a conservative nationalist revolution and a conservative nationalist state building process. And this committee has officially also a state. But at the same time, beyond this state, you have three men who govern this committee: Cemal Pasha, Enver Pasha, and particularly Talat Pasha. And each of these men has his own army or his own secret police. Many of them, they are very, very young. They have internal networks. And even when you analyze the matrimonial relations that the ruling elite, unionist elite has during this period, you see how these parallel networks are constructed and reinforced through a system of marriage and alliances. And you have the cooptation, internal cooptation of the bands that you call, by the way, bands, gangs, çete, and that's through this organization that the cartel state has survived. Each of these three men hated the other, and at the same time, they were obliged to coexist. They were obliged to coexist and use the resources of coercion, violence, and economic resources too. They have conducted, they led the Ottoman Empire to the World War I. They have organized the Armenian genocide, and they marked the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as an empire. And immediately after, the first stage of Kemalism is once again a process of cartelization. In fact, if Kemalism has succeeded between 1919 and 1921-22, the reason was that it was able to base itself partly on the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy was entirely renewed alongside the cartel interest by the Committee Union Progress, by the local economic actors that you call eşraf in Turkish, and by the remaining actors of the cartel, as the army of Kazım Karabekir, and the militarized civil actors as Yahya Kahya, and Topal Osman, that have been massively involved in the pogroms against the Greeks this time, while they had absolutely no official title. And Cherkez Ethem, who was one of the leading guerrilla leaders of the period 1919-1920, was one of them. And you have this kind of cooperation of different kind of actors that have access to the resources of coercion or violence that made the Kemalist resistance a successful resistance. Without that, Kemalism was probably doomed to failure. And immediately after, under the Kemalist regime, we see that you have a contradictory process, a double contradictory process. On one side, Kemalism proceeds to a form of rationalization of the state. The Kemalist state is a rational state, ending up with the destruction of the rationality under the Committee Union and Progress. And at the same time, this re-rationalization is made by the cooptation of the former cartel. We don't have a quite sophisticated prosopography analysis of the Kemalist leaders at the second and third level, but we know that while the man of Anwar, who was one of the leaders of the cartel, have been largely expelled from power, the men of Talat, who were the main actors of the genocide, have been massively co-opted by the Kemalist state. And this progress, this double institutionalization, it means that on one side you have rationalization, and on the other side you have a form of cooperation of the former cartel actors, has produced a lot of tensions, and these tensions have appeared clearly after 1950. 1950 is considered as a democratic moment in Turkey because you have a political pluralism, you have a political change, a new power, which is a new party which comes to power. And at the same time, because you have that kind of autonomy within the state, that the elements of the former cartels, they have been implemented, namely in the army, but also in the Ministry of Interior, you see a fragmentation taking place within the state already by the 1957-58, and this fragmentation will lead to a military coup in 1960. The fragmentation will be there also in the 1960s, and in 1971, you have a double coup d'etat. One is failed, which is organized by dissident so-called left-wing elements of the army, and the second will succeed, and the second will be the answer of the army to this internal fragmentation. 1980, you have also to some extent the same phenomenon. The 1980 military coup is a coup organized by the top hierarchy of the army, partly in order to avoid that other coup takes place or be organized by the inferior elements of the army. And throughout these long decades, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we see that the number of the actors participating to the field of coercion and violence increases considerably. Already by the 1960s, end of 1960s, you have what you call the commando camps. What are the commando camps? The commando camps are the camps, paramilitary camps. Also, they do not have access to violence or arms, but still they are paramilitary camps producing a military potential organized by the right-wing, radical right-wing party, the Party of Nationalist Action, led by Turkesh presenting himself as the Başbuğ, and Başbuğ is literally Führer. During this period also, you have the organization of the what you call the counter-guerrilla. Counter-guerrilla, which is a Turkish gladio. The counter-guerrilla does not exist, or gladio does not exist exclusively in Turkey, but the gladio structures were at once integrated to the state and largely autonomous vis-a-vis the state, because there were no official control of the state on these structures. And we know that during the 1971 and 1980 coup, these structures have played a decisive role in the field of coercion, in the field of torture. And in the 1980s, these structures have co-opted once again militants from the radical right, but also from mafia, and organized death squads in Turkey, but death squad also in Europe against the Armenians. And some of these militants, they have been involved also in the assassination temptations against Paul Johannes Paul II in 1982. This paramilitarization has been largely accelerated in the 1990s, and in the 1990s, the Turkish state is, Ümit Cizre, I think that is absolutely right. Our colleague sociologist Ümit Cizre is absolutely right. In the 1990s, you have clearly a cartel state in Turkey. You have officially a leader, but beyond this leader, you have different components participating to the state. The state, the coercion field is absolutely not controlled by the state institutions. And at the same time, the 1990s are very interesting because you have the Kurdish war. The Kurdish war by then cost some $300 billion, which is a huge amount of money. And during this period, you have a paradise of the drug connection, and the drug connection in the 1990s brings some 40 billion of dollars to the Turkish informal economy. So a war which creates possibility of obtaining a security rent, obtaining resources from the state, a drug connection or drug market, which allow you to obtain additional and very important resources, and a cartel state, which means that you have the possibility to integrate to the state through one of the multiple components of the state, official or non-official. And in the 1990s, that's the highlight period of the death squads that will kill hundreds and hundreds of persons, not exclusively, but mainly in Kurdistan. And what will be the consequences? The consequences will be that the state will govern Kurdistan through a regime of exception called OHAL. And the regime of exception will be obliged to integrate local actors to the field of coercion. And these local actors will be called the protectors, the village protectors, but we know that many of these local actors actually did not live in the villages as such. Some of them, they are obliged to accept state's offer to become protectors. The others, they are not. They are absolutely enthusiastic about getting access to the state's resources, military and economic. Each protector will receive 3 times the minimum wage and will be able to use arms, have arms and use arms. And very often that will be the tribal leaders that will receive the total global salary of the protectors, and not the protector himself. And the number of these protectors will reach to 90,000 people in 1908, 1909, and if I am not wrong, they are still around 60,000 people. So the state,
the so-called village guards,
the so-called village guards. Yeah, I said protectors, but they are actually village. Yeah, they are called officially village guards. And during this period, you have also similar experiences elsewhere, as in Algeria in the 1990s. So you will create a massive amount of potential of violence, armed and receiving salaries from the state, but at the same time not being a state organ as such, because at the micro level and at the meso level, these actors will have a huge amount of autonomy. During this period also, you have what you call the Hizbullah organization, which is a Sunni Kurdish organization, which is not created by the state, as many people could say it, which has relations with Iran, but which is not in the revolutionary reading of Vilayat-e-Faqih of Khomeini, of the Khomeini doctrine. And this organization has its own agenda, and this organization will be massively used by the state, not manipulated, but used by the state. The state will give a green light to this organization in order to implement itself locally in some regions, this time in the urban context, in the very urban context, like in Batman, in Silvan, etc. A country's president will justify this use by saying that the state has the right to get rid of its own routines and act beyond the routines. Acting beyond the routines means clearly that the state has the right to create actors of coercion which are external to its existence. And during this period also, we will see the formation of what you call the gangs in uniform. The gangs that bear state uniform, but are actually composed not by the state's agents as such, but composed by the militants of radical right and by the mafia leaders or militants. This scandal will appear in 1997 when a car accident will take place near to state the city of Susurluk. And in this car accident, you will have a sociology of what the Turkish state, cartel, but also paramilitary state was in the 1990s. And in this car accident, one of the leader of the right-wing movement, radical movement, searched by the police of the world, everywhere in the world, who has been involved in many killings of the left-wing militants, will die. But he will not be the only one to die. He will be in the same car. There was also a leading figure of the Istanbul police. So you have the police and the guy that the police officially looks for. And you will have a third man, a survival, this time, Bucak, a leader of a Kurdish tribe, who has his own private army, which is not an army of the village guards. He has also the village guards, but he has enough resources to create his own army.
From the province of Urfa.
From the province of Urfa. So we can return back to this tribal structure. But what is very important is that he, at the same time, he was a deputy of the party, of the ruling through right party, through past party of Tansu Çiller. So you have that kind of connections, and that kind of connections is are officially organized, protected, justified, legitimized at discursive level, both by Tansu Çiller, the former prime minister in 1997, and by Mehmet Ağar, who was the Minister of Interior. And the passports allowing to this right-wing militant, Abdullah Çatlı, who dies in this car accident, his passports were prepared and signed directly by the minister and not by any kind of ordinary police officer.
During that time, also Meral Akşener was the Minister of Interior.
Yes, and Meral Akşener has protected actually also this gangs. And what was also apparent during this period is that this gang was not the only one, and that this gang was a part of different series of gangs, and within the state there was a civil war. Some state agencies have been kidnapped, tortured, executed. Many other people, they have been executed because the reason was that you had to share this huge package of $40 billion, and the existence of this $40 million created a link between the paramilitary structures and the para-economic structures, and provoked unavoidably to some extent a civil war within the state. And at the same time, we know that these cartels have played a role in the formation of the GTEM, the intelligence service of the gendarmerie, that has been massively involved in the human rights violations in Kurdistan and in the forced disappearances. These gangs have been involved in the military intentation of military coup d'etat in Azerbaijan. They have provoked a huge tension, diplomatic tension between Ankara and Baku, and they have basically created the link between the end of 1960s, where the commando camps has been formed, and the 1990s. And another example illustrating this, the existence of this gang was Abdullah Çakıcı, Alaaddin Çakıcı, who has been arrested in France, who spent a couple of years in prison in France, who has been sent back to Turkey, stayed in Turkey a couple of years, and now has been liberated. And Alaaddin Çakıcı is extremely close to Devlet Bahçeli, whom he is a protege, and Devlet Bahçeli is the leader of the radical right party today in Turkey. So you see that kind of connections that have been created, and the Susurluk case has basically show the dark side of what they called the patriotic war against the PKK during the 1990s. And what has been named wrongly probably as Ergenekon in the end of 1990s and beginning of 2000s was a direct continuation of these structures, paramilitary structures that have existed in the 1990s. What is very interesting in the case of Ergenekon, an organization called Ergenekon actually has never existed, but at the same time, there were circles that you can call the Ergenekon microcosm. These circles have really existed, and these circles have been active in the Turkish politics since at least two decades. And what is the situation today? The situation is today is that all these people, the Susurluk gangs, the gangs in uniform, the microcosm of Ergenekon, they are absolutely back, and they are officially reintegrated the state structures.
When you mean back, they were liquidated for a while when AKP came to power. or sidelined.
Sidelined. Some of them they have been arrested. Some of them they have been discriminated against. They have never been liquidated as such, and they know they wouldn't be liquidated as such. They knew perfectly that one day or another they will make their triumphal coming back to the military and the coercive scene, and we know that all the circles of socializations that have been created, as I said, back to 1960s, end of 1960s, they have survived. And even once again, the matrimonial strategies here too, they are absolutely important. And one of the signs of their coming back is, of course, Mehmet Ağar, the Minister of Interior of 1970 and 1990s, whose son is a deputy today of the AKP, the party of the Erdogan's party, but also Tansu Çiller, who has become a kind of moral authority for the AKP. But in the 2000, and particularly 2010, I think that the process of cartelization and the paramilitarization went a little bit further because of many reasons. I will just remind what happened in the 2010s, the Gezi events, the protests of Istanbul, urban contest that you all have observed, the confrontation with the Gülen movement, which started in 2013 when the Gülen movement has published all the documents showing the corruption, the level of corruption of the government. And by the way, the Gülen movement was also a component of the cartel state in the at least in the beginning of the at least in the 2000s. And immediately after, you had the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt. The coup d'etat of Al-Sisi was a bloody coup d'etat, and Erdogan has interpreted this coup d'etat as a coup d'etat targeting himself personally, and not the Ikhwan, the Muslim brothers in Egypt, but himself. Thereafter, you had the peace process in Turkey that has started but has collapsed because the Kurdish movement did not accept to become a mercenary of Erdogan in Syria or in Turkey. And of course, we had 2016 aborted coup d'etat that the government or Erdogan has attributed, whose responsibility has been attributed to the Gülen movement, at least by Erdogan. And during this period, we saw that the destruction of institutions went absolutely too far, that the leader and the nation have been considered as the only two sources of legitimacy, the leader incarnating the nation in its past and in its future, and not only in its given present. A kleptocracy has taken the economic power. You have today 5 or 6 great structures, grand structures that control the Turkish economy as such. You had the emergence of an elite of opportunity, which was not necessarily Islamist in the 2000s, which was even very anti-AKP, that today has integrated the system. And during this period, you also saw the formation of the new paramilitary structures. The new paramilitary structures, among them, P and J, the police special forces and the gendarmerie special forces that are by and large controlled by the radical right. And behind the coalition that you observe between the radical right in Turkey and the AKP or the Erdogan regime, you have also the fact that the radical right can control the newly formed paramilitary organizations. And these paramilitary organizations of the police forces and the gendarmerie forces, they have been very active in the destruction of the Kurdish cities in 2015, 2016. After they have been involved in the war against the Kurds in Syria, and recently they have also been involved in war against the Armenians in the Nagorno-Karabakh. Another structure which is not armed but which has a paramilitary ambition, which is the special forces of people, halkın özel halk özel hareketi. You have other structures like the Osmanlı Ocakları, the Ottoman Hearts, which are not armed as such, but which has a paramilitary ambition, and by the way, wears uniforms, Gothic-like uniforms, but still uniforms. And you have a private security company, which is Sadat, led by a nationalist, ultra-nationalist, and ultra-Islamist former general. And to add to that, you have also to add the presidential forces. The presidential forces are probably around 3,000. They are not at all coming from, let's say, what you observe, the secret services in France, in Great Britain, or in the United States, obeying to an institutionality. On the contrary, they are absolutely independent from any kind of structures, and we don't know so much about them, their profile. And finally, we have to add the Syrian Free Army, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Syrian Free Army of 2011, which has been created by Turkey in 2015-2016, which has probably, they say, at least 50-60,000, probably that's not so much, but 15 or 20,000. And this Syrian paramilitary army force is massively involved in many places, in the Nagorno-Karabakh, of course, but in Libya, we saw it probably today in some parts of the Black Africa. There are some information concerning also Lebanon. So you have a transformation of the state, its coercive field, the field of coercion and war, which is more and more, had more and more a paramilitary structure. And parallelly, you have also a para-economy that has emerged. We have very few analytical work on the Turkish economy today, but as I said, the economic oligarchs in Turkey, there are 5 or 6, not more, and at the same time, the state or Erdogan directly controls what you call the Varlık Fonu. Varlık Fonu is the, how we can call, translate Varlık Fonu is
wealth fund.
Wealth fund, which is around between 60 and 75 billion dollars, which includes all the significant state companies in Turkey. And the use of this Varlık Fonu, the wealth fund, is absolutely not controlled by any kind of court or juridical instance. And today you have also to add some 500 million dollars affected to Erdogan as the cover fund that he can use without being obliged to explain, to justify the use. So I think that I will stop here, but I will just add that this situation that we observe in Turkey is not unique to Turkey. Recently, I have worked a lot in a comparative perspective on Putinism and on the Islamic regime in Iran. You have quite similar structures in both countries. And the problem is that, of course, when you are in such paramilitary dynamic, and when you are such cartel state, the components of this cartel state, they are not loyal to the state. And nothing shows that they will be loyal tomorrow to Erdogan, because they are not coming from an Erdoganist tradition. By the way, Erdogan has destroyed his own party. Erdogan's party today, today's AKP, has probably nothing to do with the AKP of the 2002-2003, but going even beyond that, the creation of this structure of this process of paramilitarization means also that you have destroyed the institutional logic that enables you to control the state coercion. The state coercion is something absolutely explosive. If you are a state or a regime, but you cannot control the coercion that you create, the violence that you create at the top, in this case, you are in constant danger, and nothing shows that these people, they will tomorrow obey to Erdogan if there is a deep political crisis in the country. So thank you for listening. I will stop here.
Thank you, Professor Bozarslan. I'm sure this will be extremely inspiring for the questions that are already flowing in. Two minor questions before I let them in, just to expand on certain parts, and then I'm still waiting for more questions to come in. First is the period. There was a brief period of, let's say, thaw in terms of EU reform process between 2002 until, say, 2007. Can we say that it meant a certain level of attempt to deviate from these kind of formations that marked the entire modern Turkish history? Can we say that, or was that just another blurred period?
I think that it was a blurred period, but not because Erdogan was in a manipulative logic. I think that let's put it in this way. In Islam, you have the division of the world in two categories. Darul Harb, where you have the obligation to make war, and Darul Islam, where you don't have right to use violence. And at the end of 1990s, in Turkey, but also in some other Arab countries, other Muslim countries, namely the Arab countries, this division was contested, and Europe was presented as Darul Adala, the house of justice. It means that the justice that does not exist in the Muslim world does exist in Europe, and that Europe can be a protection and horizon, but also a protection against the injustices that you observe in your own country. And don't forget that Erdogan in 2002, 2003, 2004, until 2007-8 was constantly threatened by the military. His margins of maneuver, they were extremely restricted. There was a tension between the military. The old state was still there. The constitutional court was still there. So I think that during this period, he needed to get rid of the former coercive forces, former paramilitary structures. But during this period, we also know that he had an ally, which was also a paramilitary structure to some extent, the Fethullah Gülen community.
Another minor question. You perhaps mentioned MIT, Turkish Secret Service. The current structure, by critics called often with comparisons as muhaberat, new sort of formation. Do we see a continuity between the former cadres of the MIT and the current staff or cadres of the MIT today, or do we see a complete change within this organization?
I think that there is a continuity going back up to the Hamidian structures. From that point of view, I think that we see that some prerogatives are still there, some ideological frameworks are there, the perspective that the Turkish nation is under threat is there, the security mind of the world is there, the fact that citizenship itself is threatened is there. So I think that from that point of view, there are continuities, but my impression is also that there is a sociological change. The sociological features have changed. Hakan Fidan, who is the leader of the MIT, has nothing to do with, let's say, Osman Köksal of the 1990s.
Sönmez Köksal.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, who was coming from a Kemalist tradition, who was westernized, who probably was able to read what the American Claudius structures or counter-insurrection theory doctrines had to say. So I think that he was much more open to this world, but a very repressive world, as I said, the counter-insurrection theorists of Pentagon or of the French army in the 1950s, they were absolutely hateful doctrines, but he was in the intersection of this world arena. while I think that today the situation is very different.
Leaving aside your perspectives on the future, I am now going to the section of the questions. Let's begin by Hassan Ghazi's question. What is the official position and justification to cover up these outlaw bands?
Officially, the logic is the following, and I think that Tansu Çiller, the former prime minister, has explained it. Those who shot for the homeland or who are shot for the homeland, they are equally heroic and patriotic. And this idea that the patriotism cannot accept any control or by the state, by the law, is absolutely there. It has been there in the Hamidian discourse, it was very clearly there. In the unionist discourse, it was clearly there. And when you see the Turkish movies, namely the Valley of the Wolves, you observe that very, very clearly. You have a mafia structure, but which is patriotic and whose mission. Recently, you had another movie, a series, one of these, the episode of this series is about Abdul Hamid, and Abdul Hamid's secret agents, they are killing the opponents in the street, in the forest of Istanbul. So this idea that if you are patriotic, you cannot be, and you have the urgency of the saving the country, ensuring the future of the country. In this case, you cannot be, you are not entitled to obey to the law, because the law is a restriction. You have that also actually in Russia. One of the most popular series of Russia in the 2000s was Bra, telling the story of a veteran of the Chechen War coming back to St. Petersburg to clean St. Petersburg. And you cannot clean St. Petersburg, it means Russify St. Petersburg if you obey the law.
Let's continue with the question by Professor Fatma Müge Göcek. Thank you, Professor Bozarslan, for your brilliant presentation. Historically, tracing the connection between the Turkish state and publicly silenced violence. Have you looked into how and when this inner violence was formally presented by the Turkish state externally? I am interested in how the Turkish state selects to formally address certain violent events and not others.
Probably there you have some historical periods, but they are very, very short periods. You know that in 1908, even the state was speaking about the massacres of Armenians in the 1894, 1896. We know that Erdogan, for instance, has insisted on the massacres of Dersim, in 1937, 38. So you have that kind of episodes. They are very brief episodes that can show also that the things, they are not yet fixed, that there is no determinism, that there are internal fightings within the state. For Erdogan, for instance, that we know that he read a book of Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, including a chapter on Dersim. But the problem is that all this, they do not lead to any kind of reflection, deeper reflection, and any kind of consistency. And similarly, when the state speaks about its inner violence, it takes a very short time. Concerning, for instance, the Susurluk case, this civil war within the state in the 1990s, through the participation of the gangs in uniform, we have hundreds of thousands of documents. There have been at least 3 official commissions. So basically, we know everything. And at the same time, knowing this everything does not mean that this knowledge will have transformative effects. Within a couple of days, that all can be totally forgotten. That's why Taner Akçam uses the concept of black hole, because basically concerning the Armenian genocide, you cannot bring anything anymore. Everything is there. But even the state's own documents show that there was a genocide. And at the same time, this knowledge falls into this huge black hole and loses any kind of any kind of its meaning. And this question of, can a society exist without having a critical memory, a criticism of memory? Probably not, but you have this case also, for instance, in Russia, the Gulag history, the history of the execution of the of 1938, all that is known. And at the same time, the leader, the president of Russian Constitutional Court says that Russia is governed by a memocracy. What is the function of the democracy? The function of the democracy is to get rid of these bloody pages of the history and to create a unique historical discourse going back to the 17th century, 18th century, and to present the history of the nation as a history of historical mission, and as all that had no meaning at all. That history takes place at another level, and that this another level, this other level, which is a continuous level, a linear level, that gives sense to the nation, but also to the history of the nation.
Professor Nurasheni wonders what you think about the fact that Erdogan gave a mission to Mr. Tanrıverdi, Adnan Tanrıverdi, I think Adnan is his name, one of his close consultants and the founder of Sadat, to prepare a common constitution to all Islamic countries. He declared this at the closing speech of the 8th Islamic Shura in late November 2020. What do you think about that?
I think that Tanrıverdi has already proposed this project since 7-8 years. That was not a recent moment, but I think that for while being, what is important in the case of Erdogan is that he deems that Turkey has a historical mission. Once again, this is the idea of historical mission, that this historical mission allows and opens to Ankara all the doors in the former Ottoman space, in the Arab world, but also probably in the Caucasian part of the world, also in the Balkans, in Macedonia, etc. And that this historical mission has an economic dimension, has clearly an ideological dimension, and a military dimension. And at the three levels, you have to play a federative role. Turkey has to play a federative role. Playing a federative role also means that you constitute the heart, the hardcore of the former Ottoman Empire. Economically, you are the reference. Ideologically, you are the reference. Symbolically, Erdogan incarnates the historical mission, and of course, that's up to Turkey to have also this organization, this coordination of the military level. And this, I am extremely worried about that, because it produces effects. It produces a lot of effect. Tomorrow, I am not sure that Turkey will not be involved in Lebanon. There are arms going to Lebanon. I am not sure that Turkey will not be involved in Somalia. Militarily, I mean, not only from a humanitarian perspective. Somalia has never been a part of course, of Turkey. So I think that here we have something quite worrying.
A couple of questions from Professor Karabekir Akkoyunlu. One, tutelage, vesayet, was emphasized in the early AKP era as the target of the government's reform attempts. Since then, the tutelary structures were first disassembled 2008 through 2013, and then returned as part of the new Cartel 2013 to present. Yet, government officials and pro-government media still frequently refer to a notion of social, cultural, and global tutelage against which they are supposedly taking a series of radical actions. What does this tell us about the notion of tutelage? Has it become an empty signifier, you think?
I think that it is this concept has no more any pertinence in Turkey. I mean, when you make the political sociology of Turkey, I think that this concept of tutelage does not have any function, but it has a very huge instrumental weight. And the idea is that Turkey's historical mission has been attacked by the external powers, imperialist powers, Christian power, whatever we can imagine, who collaborated with the internal enemies, the Armenians, the Kurds, whatever you can imagine once again. And more importantly, that the Turkish elites have been alienated to themselves. And the Turkish elites have not only lost their own ontological purity, but they have also altered the ontological purity of the Turkish nation. And today the task is to restore the Turkish nation in its original ontological purity. And the elites are unhappy by this project, and the elites want to impose on their own tutelage by working with the external powers, of course, and internal enemies, in order to avert Erdogan's temptation to create once again this Turkish grandeur, this Turkish ontological purity, start once again Turkish historical mission. This idea of historical mission is absolutely central in the discourse of Erdogan. For Erdogan, there are 3 dates which are very, very important. 2023. 2023 is the 100th anniversary of the Republic. That was a kind of emancipation, but half emancipation. That was not a total delivery, because Europe has imposed the borders of Turkey. Europe obliged Turkey to suppress the caliphate. We know that that's all not true, but that's the discourse that has produced. So 2023 is the moment of the celebration of a half victory. 2053 is the beginning of the 600th anniversary of the conquest of Istanbul. That's the beginning of the imperial mission of the Turkish nation. The Ottoman Beylikat became an empire, and the imperial mission starts only in 2053. And 2071, the 1000th anniversary of Malazgirt, and this means that the beginning of the historical mission was in 1071. And by 2071, everything has to be done in order that the Turks start once again a new millennium of historical mission. And that requires, of course, strength, power, but the power requires energy, collective energy, and national energy requires ontological purity.
I see. Then the second part is, I think, brings us slightly into the future of cartel state. Akkoyunlu wonders, that it says that you trace the origins of the cartel state to Abdülhamit II. Does this mean that modern Turkey has never had a rational state logic? What then is the way out of cartel state?
As I said, during the Kemalist period, that was a kind of rationalization of the state, because the pre-Kemalist Turkey is a Turkey in ruins. So you have a kind of re-institutionalization, but this re-institutionalization incorporates the former elements of the cartel and includes, in any case, a huge internal tension that will explode thereafter. What is the way out? The way out, of course, is citizenship. That's the democratization. Democratization is the creation of institutions that are able to, they accept to be controlled by the mechanisms that are external to them. So I think that there is no other way. The rationality of the state is the legality of the state. That's why Weber established this link between the rationality of the state and the legality of the state. If you don't have a legal state, you cannot have a rational state. And at the same time, if you don't have a rational state, of course, you will not have a legal state. And that's totally independent, interdependent.
A brief commentary by Dr. Mehmet Ali Dikerdem. It might be useful to look at the continuities between the Unionist Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa and its palimpsest of the Republican military apparatus before and after May 1960, including juntas forming and reforming as Silahlı Kuvvetler Birliği, Union of Armed Forces. There are all sorts of murky links between NATO-generated Özel Harp Dairesi, special warfare, special ops, and so on.
I totally do agree. And I think that we still have a lot of research field before us. I will not be too much provocative, but I will say that maybe the Turkish Republic has not been formed by the military, a military elite, but by a civil elite, half civil elite, which was Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa. In the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, many of them, they had official titles, military titles, but actually they were not exactly military. Even Bahattin Shakir is not exactly a military, Talat is not a military, and all these people, they have been massively, not of course, Dr. Nazım has been executed, Bahattin Shakir has been killed, Talat also, but when you take people like Renda, etc., all that they are coming from, to some extent from the Committee Union and Progress, and some of them from the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa. And you are absolutely right, in the 1960s and 70s, what happens is that this logic of the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa takes over the military logic, the logic of the military institution within the army. And the Gladio counter-guerrilla is to large extent this, but the Harp Dairesi is to large extent this, and it is also encouraged by the then profoundly anti-communist Pentagon, who encouraged that kind of formations everywhere. In Spain, of course, in Italy, we know a lot about the Italian Gladio, and naturally also in Turkey.
Saad Kemal's question, what happens, and that brings us to the future, what happens to cartel state after Erdogan, or if the current opposition comes to power?
I don't know how the current opposition can come to power in the given structures. My answer will be, for instance, in the Russian case, it might be much more easier to reproduce the military industrial complex after Putin. The structures have still a kind of rationality, internal rationality, probably a kind of autonomy, while in Turkey, I think that the destruction of rationality went really too far. And what will happen immediately after, if Erdogan leaves the power, I will make no prediction at all, but it is very difficult for me to see how the Erdogan regime can be reproduced in time without Erdogan.
A comment from Evan Grant. It says 1997 car crash, transnational organized crime, customs service intelligence analyst for TNOC. This car crash was widely reported internationally at the time. And it was the first time, he says, I ever heard the term deep state. Anyone considering such structures anywhere needs to study the case and think hard. Thank you for raising this hugely important question, he says. So let's move on to another question. I have many coming in. One is the linkage between, or let me see, do you think Erdogan will eventually get rid of MHP leader Bahçeli? Again, looking into the current structure in a new Night of the Long Knives, with Bahçeli in the role of the Turkish Ernst Röhm, of course, because the MHP is a threat for the AKP and total control of Turkey. What do you think?
Of course, we cannot exclude this hypothesis. We cannot exclude this hypothesis, and at the same time, we should not forget Nadejda, that the MHP has access to huge amount of potential of violence and coercion. As I said, MHP controls large sectors of the new paramilitary structures. The MHP controls also, at some level, the Ministry of Interior. There is a relation between some ministries and the religious brotherhoods that still that yet we have to study. So I think that MHP for a while being is quite strong, because the main structures of paramilitary structures are controlled. That's my reading, at least, not by Erdogan himself, but by MHP. So what will be the answer of MHP if tomorrow Erdogan will want to launch a night of long nights? It is very difficult to predict it for a while being, but of course a tension, a very radical tension, is possible between them. And just give one thing in the case of Susurluk. Susurluk was a war, a civil war within the state.
Sarah Glynn, a recent article in Counterpunch outlined the role of the post-war CIA in creating clandestine groups and wars on the left and Kurds. Can you comment on this and the role of the US and other foreign forces today?
Today, my impression is that that's not true anymore. Not true anymore, but it was largely true during the 1960s and 1970s. All the literature that the Turkish army, but also the police and the MIT and the secret services used, and that have been published, by the way, in the 1970s, all this literature was patented by the Pentagon. The Pentagon counter-insurrection theories have been applied in Asia, in Latin America. The wars of Latin America in the 1980s is partly linked to that. The military coups in 1960s and 70s in Latin America, and that was absolutely the case in Turkey. Today, my impression is that that's not the case anymore. Turkey does not need, or at least the Erdogan regime does not need any input or any theoretical let's say justification, legitimization, any practical level of action in Pentagon, because I think that it has developed, the Erdogan regime that has developed its own tools concerning this field, and there is also a huge tension going on between the United States and Turkey, at least since 10 years.
Professor Bozarslan, my question, some people wonder, and justifiably so, the period between 2002, 2009, let's say, was a special period where we could not really see clearly what sort of internal wars and clashes within these what you call cartel state formations and components. And then came Gezi protests, and then, as you mentioned, these two huge graft probes at the end of 2013. And then things started to change in a way, sort of, back to where it was, to sort of old rules of the game. What prompted Erdogan to choose to merge himself and the groups that he formed around himself as sort of new cartel state components to, if you will, with the current components of the cartel state, which are old components of the cartel state?
They are the old components of cartel state, but the situation is very new. The situation has radically changed. The old components of the cartel state have been integrated in a system which has something radically new. Today, Erdogan's Turkey considers itself as a radical, viral, irreducible alternative to the liberal democracy. And this is something totally reflexive. That's also the case in Russia. That's also the case in Iran. While in the 1970s, or 1980s, you didn't have such a perspective. That was not such a reflexivity. Turkey considering itself as one of the main actors in the world history, but one of the main actors in the world history as a radical alternative to the liberal democracy. That's something new. What changed? I think that there is a historical perspective that we should take into account. I think that in a couple of speeches, I explained that Erdogan has read only 10 or 15 books in his entire life. He read these books in the 1970s when he was a young Islamist militant, anti-Semite, believing in the conspiracy theories. And I think that these books, they have created a kind of cognitive stock. And after 2013, when the crisis come one after the other, and that he badly missed any kind of key to read this crisis, he returned back to his cognitive stock formed in the 1970s and explaining everything as the consequences of the conspiracies coming from the outside or from the inside, conspiracies against the Turkish nation and against Islam protected as it is protected by the Turkish nation, against Turkish nation as it is in its essence Islamic. And I think that this discourse that the world has no other history then the history of the war against Turkey, against the Turks, has been reactivated. So the crises that followed each other, I think that created this extreme urgency to give to make a sense of the world, to give a sense to the world history, and this sense he found it in the 1970s. And I think that once he has returned to this reading of the world, he has radicalized himself, and this radicalization has also brought him to incorporate all these elements that hated him in the beginning of 2000s. In the beginning of 2000s, the grey wolves were not partisan followers of Erdogan, not at all. Today, they are integrated.
The current situation, the internal balances, which are very shaky, I think more and more shaky because of the multiple crises, multi-layered crisis that's taking place in Turkey. Does looking at the future, the crisis at the end, can it, because of the nature of the survivability of the old components of the cartel state, can they turn Erdogan into a liability to somebody or leader that can be gotten rid of?
Very difficult to answer this question, because on one side, the perception of the time of Erdogan is an eternal perception. As I said, it has to go to 2071. So that's a very long-term historical perspective. And at the same time, in order to get to this 2071, you need a time, and this time is a constantly fragmented time. That's the time of crisis, and each crisis is overcome through either hubris, a new adventure externally, either an internal conflict, and each crisis is overcome, and so you have a very short period of the pragmatism, but this pragmatism doesn't last. At one point, this way of managing crisis might not be possible anymore, and the regime can be eternal. But at one point, we also might see a total collapse, and we don't know how this kind of regimes they do collapse. But we saw that in Iran, for instance, and the Shah has collapsed while he was appearing so powerful. We saw that in many other places, even including in the Russian Revolution. We saw that. So we don't know. We can know that only a posteriori how such a regime can collapse. But for while being, one has the impression that this very long-term perspective, historical perspective, and very short-term and fragmented time do coexist.
Fatma Müge Göçek wonders, is there a written paper on what you lectured today?
Fatma, hi, how are you? Not yet, but I will have a book in French, which will be published in the beginning of May.
Okay, and there is, I think, one question about the Kurdish aspect. How do you explain, let me see, çözüm süreci, peace talks with the PKK? Why do you think Erdogan walked away from that? It was an interesting momentum, about 2 years.
Yes, it was a very interesting momentum, but I think that we can make some comparison with 1914, 1915 and the Armenian genocide. There is no Kurdish genocide. We are not facing a genocide. So just be clear, I don't want to make any kind of confusion, but there are some parallels between two historical moments. In 1914, the discourse of the Committee Union and Progress, and including Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, Bahattin Shakir, is the following thing. We do recognize you, the Armenians. You have the political parties, we do respect them. We even recognize that we have been unjust towards you by the past. But now that this recognition has taken place, you have to be at the service of the Turkish nation. The Armenian agenda was a totally different agenda. The Armenian agenda was to rebuild the Ottoman Empire on entirely new grounds, entirely new foundations, to ensure an equality based on the citizenship among the Armenians. And that's because the Armenians have refused this obligation to be at the service of the Turkish nation, that the genocide took place. That was not the only reason, of course, but that was one of the reasons. And 2014, 2015, 100 later, when you take Erdogan's discourse, Erdogan says to the Kurds, we the Turks, we do recognize you. We do recognize your political parties. We do recognize that we have been unjust vis-a-vis you in the future, in the past. But now that this recognition has taken place, you have to be at the service of the Sunni Turkish nation. And the Kurdish movement refuses that first in Syria. Kobane is a part of this refusal. And the Kurdish nation refused that in 2015 in the elections by preventing Erdogan to access to full presidential system already by 2015. And that is considered as a betrayal by the Kurds, as a non-answer to the recognition, and the mechanism of destruction has launched already by that. So I think that this historical perspective comparison can explain us why the Tutelage, the so-called peace process, has collapsed.
And give us a few words about the closure case against the HDP. What are your thoughts about the consequences of that?
I think that the consequences will be, to a very large extent, insignificant concerning the Kurdish history. When you take the Kurdish momentum, which in Turkey goes back to 100 years ago, but particularly the politicization of the Kurdish movement as an urban movement has started already in 1977. And even if tomorrow the HDP is not allowed to participate in the elections, even if tomorrow Erdogan imposes himself once again, he is elected because the Kurdish movement cannot participate to the elections, the sense, the meaning of the Kurdish movement is not in the elections. It's in its capacity to reproduce itself in time as hegemonic bloc, and the HDP has a hegemonic bloc, interclass, intergender, intergenerational hegemonic bloc. It is definitely the main actor there. And so even if you arrest all the members of the HDP and prevent it from entering into the parliament, at the long run, that will not change so much concerning the Kurdish history itself, or the Kurdish subjectivities itself, the Kurdish idea of being a Kurd, reading the Kurds history, projecting the Kurds in the future, because all this is also about becoming subject. For Erdogan, the Kurds are the object of the Turks, the object of the Turkish history. Their history is determined by the Turks. The identity is determined by the Turks. While for the Kurds, but not only for the Kurds, for any minority movement, what is at stake is to becoming subject, saying that I, in my present, I read my history differently, I project myself in the future differently, and I refuse to be a minority. I want to become a majority. Whatever the formulation or administrative form that it might take, that's Kant, that's Immanuel Kant. Becoming a subject, becoming a citizen, is to break down the status of minority to which you are condemned to, in order to become major means responsible and free. So concerning the Kurds, I think that this will not change so much. Concerning the future of democracy in Turkey, that's another thing. I think that will be a huge blow for the future of democracy in Turkey itself.
On these notes, fascinating. It was a delight to listen to you, Professor Hamit Bozarslan. Thank you very much. Let's stop here, and it's time to take a family photo. Those who do not wish to be in that family photo, please shut down your cameras. And those who do wish to be in the family photo, please open your cameras, put them on, please. So let's have it. I think we are done. I hope so. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for being with us. CEFTUS Talks will continue. It's an interesting, fascinating story, puzzling story, Turkey. We leave another CEFTUS session, still confused, but at a higher level. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Good evening.